All right. Well, today we got Billy talking to us about a lot of stuff. You're covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, it was a short article that I read called the Colony Size Drives Honeybees Over Winter Survival. It was an article about an experiment, which kind of a basic experiment that they did, but had kind of surprising results to it, and so there got to be kind of a lot of information. So sorry about that, but
No worries. Oh, sorry.
so okay, so the primary things they were kind of looking at were the bee colony survival over winter survival rate is about 70%. It was a belief that genetics played a role in the bees' climate that they were in. They were locally adapted to the climate that they were in, and that bees in the U.S., they call them geographically scrambled because bees in the U.S. are shipped all over the U.S. to different climates and stuff. And so the question becomes, if the bees are kept closer to home, would that increase their chances of overwinter survival because they are locally adapted to that climate?
Oh, that was the. Oh, I see. Aha.
I don't know what happened there. Can you go back?
So.
That's
one,
weird.
2.
That must have been one early morning.
No worries. This is what I've got next.
Okay, go back one. I think I had one appear and then I never fixed it, where it says hypothesis.
That was right there.
There it is. Okay, so this is what they were saying. Locally adaptive genetic traits may not necessarily stay in the place where they are advantageous. Like what I was saying, where bees are reared up, where the queen is from, where the colony is from, then moving to a different climate is not the most effective way to raise that colony. Okay, now go. Sorry. Okay, so what they did this experiment up in northern U.S. up near Penn State. They got separate colonies from Vermont and West Virginia, two northern areas, and then they got southern from Texas and Florida. And all those colonies, they put 60 colonies near the Penn State in 3 different apiary locations. No surprise, but kind of a surprise. They had a 30% death rate, or 30% of the colonies did not survive over winter. Goes along with the United States' average. They found that the 2 northern colonies from Vermont and West Virginia had no genetic difference. Same with the southern Texas and Florida, no genetic difference. And the biggest surprise that they found doing this experiment was the northern compared to the southern colonies it was significant, but it was a very small genetic difference, meaning they were very similar. So the locally adapted genetics played no part in the overwinter survival rate because they found the same. Go on. Sorry, I was not sure what happened here.
No worries.
Yeah, they were finding the biggest predictor of the overwinter survival rate was the size of the colony and the number of worker bees in October. The number of worker bees in October, they said they used the food storage more effectively, and their thermoregulatory cluster was bigger, keeping the hive warmer. Genetics didn't play a role in it. The colony weight, they found if the colony was greater than 66 pounds, it had a 90% chance, 90% survival rate. If it was less than 44, it dropped pretty drastically. I didn't delete that. Sorry. And so the biggest part that they found to this was that the apiary location played the largest role. This wasn't part of their experiment, so they couldn't come out with like clear results saying, "Hey, this is what happened." But their suggestion was that the one location was near an agricultural area and natural landscape area that had, you could see, a 90% survival rate. And the other locations were around forests and around developed land, houses, a lot of concrete and stuff, less variability, and that had only about a 60% survival. So they recommended at the end of this experiment, which, like I said, this wasn't what their experiment was based on. Their experiment was looking for genetics. See what that did. They found out that genetics played very little role, if no role. So their recommendation was to track your colony size during the summer to make sure that it is increasing. And if your colony was too small, you could add pollen, add sugar syrup in there to help boost your numbers to grow. Or if you have multiple small colonies, combine them so you have one large, and you'll have a lot greater overwinter survival.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much.
I'm just curious, how do you know the actual weight for the colony size? Like, do you know? Did it say on the article?
I don't. It just said the weight of the colony was 66 pounds. It had this. The weight of the colony was this. It talked a lot about the weight of the colony, but I didn't look up how to weigh a colony.
Like a lot of people at that beekeeper meeting were saying that they had so many problems with their hives overwintering. Do you know where they what kind of landscapes they keep their bees in?
I guess so. To address the first question, then he gets the second one. My understanding is that there are any number of sort of jury-rigged weighing solutions. What some people do, a lot of these beekeepers, what they have is basically they've got like a truck they use to haul their hives around on, and they've got a little, basically an elevated winch that they can use to lift and drop the boxes, and they can just attach like a standard sort of a spring scale to that and use that to weigh their boxes. Some people have the ability to, they'll have their boxes on like some sort of flat surface that they can hook to the scale and then winch it up to weigh it that way. There's any number of different systems people use to weigh. We're going to go out to Bayer at some point to see some of the stuff they're doing. And what Bayer does as their research station is they've got the box permanently sitting on an electronic scale that just weighs it all the time. They can track total hive weight over the growing season. So tracking weight is one of those things that if I was like a backyard beekeeper, it'd be relatively easy. I'd just go out there, and if I had like 4 or 5 hives, you could just like hook them onto a scale and pull them up or something and get a weight. But if I'm a commercial beekeeper with thousands of hives, it might be kind of difficult to keep track. Rob here, what was where they're keeping their bees over the winter?
Yeah, do they keep them in actual fields or they
I have no idea. What some of these, I imagine what they're doing is keeping them in fields for the most part. I think something to keep in mind is that if they're doing this research in central Pennsylvania and Vermont, agricultural and natural landscapes are going to look a lot more like maybe the Sierras. They're going to be very wooded, but it's also going to generally be greener. So, whereas out here, if I were to plop some stuff out, well, then again, out here you might even be better off because we've got any number of sort of winter weeds and things coming up at this season rather than be covered in snow. So I'd be kind of curious how the two different landscapes would compare. Towards the end of this year, we're having a guest talk by one of the
Who was the researcher on this? Meredith Walker. I'm not familiar with her.
She was
Oh.
the one that wrote the article. The one who did the experiment was Dope.
Dope?
His name?
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be meeting with a guy, or be hearing from a guy out in the Philadelphia area. He's going to be talking about urban beekeeping, but his research is largely on how the broader landscape impacts honeybees. So he did some research where he had hives set out in various locations on a gradient from super rural Ohio to like Cleveland. And so he would take map images of like a 3-kilometer circle around the hives. He would classify all the landscape down to agricultural, urban, paved surfaces, and then look at how, if we saw any differences in bee health based off of what landscape they were in. So we'll have a chance to touch on some of those bigger landscape impacts later. But anyway, why don't we jump back into where we were, continue on our slow sink into falling further and further behind this semester. That's okay, we got some extra stuff booked in just in case that sort of thing happens. All right, so last time where we wrapped up was we were talking about the various roles that worker bees work in hives. And just as a reminder, right, when worker bees are born, well, when they're born, they're larvae living in cells, but eventually when they emerge as adults and live their functioning worker bee life cycle, they go through a number of roles based on how old they are. They emerge initially as cleaners. After their hypopharyngeal glands develop, they become nurse bees. Eventually, those glands become less efficient, and up until about 3 weeks of life, they basically work any number of jobs. But then the big transition is right here around the 18 to 21 day mark, and this is where the bees will transition from being repelled by light to being attracted to light. And so this is when they start doing out-of-the-hive jobs, such as guarding and carrying water. And this is where bees become what we call field bees. So in the literature, when you're talking to beekeepers, sometimes you'll hear them differentiate between hive bees and field bees, and this is the big difference. Hive bees are young workers that are primarily staying in the hives. Field bees are those that are going to forage out and about as their main purpose. Yeah, so functionally, field bees are foragers. That's their main job. They may do other roles in the hive, but for the most part, they're out there looking for resources. And primarily, they're looking for nectar, which is the primary carbohydrate source of bees that they use to make honey. They're looking for pollen, which is their main source of protein. So they're searching for food. They're out there looking for water. And then in addition to that, they're also searching for plant resins. And the main reason for plant resin is that they combine plant resin with saliva and nectar to make propolis. We talked about propolis a few times, but just as a reminder, propolis is basically a resinous mixture made, again, of saliva, resin, and wax, not honey. And the bees use this for any number of purposes, mostly for sealing things up, keeping the hive nice and tight, and easier to regulate things like temperature, humidity, odds and ends like that. Generally, when a bee becomes a forager, they're pretty close to dying. Most foragers only last from somewhere from 10 days to 21 days, so a relatively short period of time. And so this limits their total lifespan to typically somewhere around 50 to 60 days. But like I mentioned when we were leaving class last time, this is really dependent on activity. Worker bees basically work themselves to death. So if they're born, if an egg is laid at the beginning of the nectar flow, those bees probably won't last very long. They'll live that 50 to 60 days. But if you're one of the last eggs laid in the season and you emerge from your pupal state in, say, late fall or early winter, they're going to keep you around for a couple of months because there's nothing to forage for. You're not doing the most arduous of jobs. You're probably just doing thermoregulation during the winter, and those worker bees may last for months and months and months. But you'll notice this when you, I've noticed this at least, when you're out and about and you see a bee that's really struggling, like a forager, just on a flower or laying on the ground and it's like in the process of dying. If you take a look at it, those bees are pretty raggedy. You'll notice the edges of their wings oftentimes have lots of missing bits. They're pretty chewed up looking. And that's just basically because these bees work and work and work until their bodies fall apart, is essentially what they're doing. So, busy as a bee comes with some disadvantages. You can apply that metaphor to your life if you choose. Let's see. Oh, geez, why did I put that on there? We already talked about that. Right. So if we're talking about the death of bees, typically what happens is the foragers leave the hive, they go out and look for food, and they just never come back. So, typically what it is, right, is they just go out and they are so depleted of energy, they just die on the spot, or maybe they get caught by a predator. It's much more risky to be out of the hive than in the hive. Though you will see large die-offs in the hive if there's inclement weather. So if it's been raining for several days or it's been really windy, bees typically do not leave the hive because it's kind of dangerous to go forage in those conditions. And so, the bees will start dying in the hive of old age, and at which point the undertakers will just pick them up and throw them out. So sometimes you'll see piles of dead bees after bad weather. All right. So to wrap up bee roles, something I wanted to point out is that on that last slide a little while ago, I listed out all these different things that bees do, like nurses and water carriers and thermoregulars and odds and ends. The main point I want to make is that not all bees work all of those roles. So there are a lot of roles. Generally what you'll see is most bees will work a handful of those roles. In general, all bees will be a nurse at some point, all bees will be cleaners at some point, and all bees typically become foragers at some point. But between those, when you're looking at things like ripening honey, building wax comb, all of that, what you become is going to depend more on the needs of the hive than some sort of predetermined, genetic programming. So what you'll typically find, right, is that, if you're born at a time where there's a high nectar flow, they're going to need lots and lots of nurses. So a lot of bees will stay nurses for a longer period of time because you're rearing a lot of brood in response to the excess resources. Similarly, you'll need more foragers, you'll need more honey ripeners, and so you might not have a whole lot of people dedicated to wax production. Similarly, in the summertime, you might have more bees getting dedicated to regulating hive temperature. And in the winter, generally you'll just see a decrease in almost everything because there's just fewer resources. So point being, these honeybee hives are highly flexible. They have the ability to push workers into this role or that role depending on the needs. So I just wanted to say that it's a little misleading when you see the list of at this age I do this and this and this and this. That's the general outline, but things can change. Cool. So let's talk about the actual bee life cycle. Where do little baby bees come from? So, as far as bee life cycle is concerned, oftentimes people group bees into two major categories. They say bees are either brood or they are adults. And brood is just sort of the collective term for all of the immature stages of the bees that stay inside the cells. So the eggs, the larvae, and the pupa. Honeybees are hymenoptera, so they are holocyclic, right? So they have those 4 stages to their life cycle: egg, larval, pupal, adult. So we're just going to go through those real quick. So as far as eggs are concerned, eggs are exclusively laid by the queen. There are some situations, so the queen, you got all these workers, right? Did it just suddenly become sunny on Sunday? Yeah, great. So, where was I? I was complaining. No, I complained, and then I was going to talk. Okay, so, you got all these workers roaming around, right? And they're females, but they're sterile females. They don't have fully produced ovaries. The reason they're sterile is the queen is producing a pheromone in her mandibles called mandibular factor. And this stuff basically stops the workers from developing. That being said, when the queen gets really old, she stops producing pheromones as efficiently, and some of the workers can actually revert to a reproductive form, and they'll start producing eggs, and they'll start trying to lay eggs, but they're not really good eggs. But anyway, so sometimes you'll see laying by workers, but it's uncommon. But so in the vast majority of the time, eggs are laid into the bottom of the cell by the queen. That's basically her job. And the queen, as I mentioned before, will either lay fertilized eggs, where she puts a little bit of sperm in them, and those turn into, females, right? So those will be either queens or workers, or she'll lay haploid eggs, those without any sperm, and those will turn into males. So The type of egg that she lays is going to depend on the size and the orientation of the cell she's laying into. Generally, brood cells are mostly going to be about 5 millimeters in diameter, and they're going to be horizontal, meaning facing sideways on the comb, right? That's a sign that that's a worker cell, so she'll put fertilized cells in those. Drones are bigger than workers, so drone cells are going to be about 20% larger. They're going to be 6 millimeters in diameter. So the queen basically can pop her abdomen into a cell, or sometimes she'll put her head in and feel around with her antenna to see how large it is, and she can tell if it's a drone cell or a worker cell. And then she'll put her abdomen in, and she'll deposit an egg directly into the bottom of the cell. And we handed out that comb last week. You saw how small the cells are, right? So these are incredibly small eggs sitting at the bottom. Now, we cannot tell the difference between a fertilized and an unfertilized cell just by looking at it, but it seems that workers are capable of doing that. So worker bees will actually check the queen's work. So they'll check all the eggs, and if they find the wrong egg in the wrong cell, so if she puts a drone cell in a worker's cell, they'll pull it out and destroy it. So they're keeping an eye to make sure the queen's not screwing up. Those stay in there for about 3 days, and then they hatch. But they don't really hatch. The cells just, the eggs just kind of turn into larvae. So it's not like they rupture open and something crawls out. The outside of this egg just sort of becomes the outside of the larva. So as far as the larva is concerned, there's nothing particularly interesting about it morphologically. It's featureless, white, and grub-like. It doesn't really have any noticeable legs. And it just sort of spends all of its time inside the cells. So this would be a pretty typical look at a brood cell, or a section of brood cells in the comb. If you look straight down, you can see there's a whole bunch of larvae all hanging out in there. There are 5 instars. The development time is dependent on what sort of caste it belongs to. And we'll jump in. There we go. Queens tend to develop very quickly, about 5.5 days. Workers are 6 days. Drones are 7 days in the larval stage. But regardless of that, these larvae are going to be regularly visited by nurse bees. They're going to be inspected for health. They're going to be provisioned with food. In general, at the beginning of their life cycle, right after they hatch, they're going to be given a big pool of royal jelly, which is that white stuff that they're sitting in. And they're typically just put in a big pool of it. They'll just deposit way more than the larva needs at the moment. They'll sort of swim in it, consume it. And then, depending on what caste they are, they will either be transitioned over to honey and pollen, if they're a worker, or they'll be fed on royal jelly until they pupate, if they're a queen. So all in all, in this time, people have sat there and measured how many times larvae have been visited. And some larvae get visited up to like 1,500 times by workers. So very, very high level of care in this. So when they hit their last larval instar, so when they hit instar 5, they hit sort of a pre-pupal stage where they're starting to pupate. At that point, the workers will come through and they will cap the cell that they're inside, and they enter what's called the capped brood stage. Now, something I found kind of interesting about this was that when they capped the brood, they capped them with a mix of old wax, propolis, and new wax, and so the caps on the brood have sort of a dark brown, dirty color to it. Whereas when they cap honey, honey is almost always capped with brand new wax, so it's nice and white. So if you look at a comb that you pull out, you'll be able to easily tell the difference between honey, brood, and even pollen, because pollen's only going to be partially filled with that honey glaze on the top. So the 3 major types of cells are all easily differentiated from one another just by color. So while they're in their pupal stage, basically they weave a little silk cocoon, they remain motionless, and they just start to develop. Standard sort of pupation, they liquefy their bodies, basically become insect soup, and then the cells re-aggregate, form new structures.
And the amount of time it takes to go through this is again going to depend on what caste you are. Queens develop relatively quickly. We're talking about 7.5 days, whereas workers and drones take closer to 2 weeks to go through this. Consequently, total development time varies pretty substantially. So queens develop very quickly. You can go from having a queen cell to having a full-blown queen in just over 2 weeks, whereas workers and drones are going to take around 3 weeks each. Pretty standard. So yeah, so this is just sort of an outline of the bee life cycle. You can see all of them take about 3 days for eggs. When they get capped is going to vary between the different groups. And then the major difference between, say, a queen and a worker is just the amount of time they spend in their pupal stage. I think this is largely dependent on the food source. If you're a worker bee, round about here, 3 days in your larval stage, they switch you from royal jelly to honey and pollen, which is not nearly as nutrient rich, and so you end up developing a little slower. Oh yeah, well I talked about that. Right. So one major thing that bears addressing is the fact that queens and workers basically both come from fertilized eggs. So it's been kind of a question, what is it that causes worker bees to become worker bees and queen bees to become queen bees if the original source is functionally the same? And the major development here, the major difference here is going to be the food they're provisioned with. Queens are going to get royal jelly the whole time they're developing. And as I mentioned before, royal jelly is just a really, really great food source. It's got tons of protein, tons of fat, tons of carbs, lots of vitamins and minerals and hormones to stimulate growth. It's sort of the ideal mixture to grow up on. It's like breast milk. Whereas workers, after getting royal jelly for the first 2 or 3 days of their larval stage, will be switched over to honey and pollen. It's not super clear why royal jelly allows the queens to become fertile and the workers to not be fertile by eating pollen and honey. But what they have found is that around the time that the workers get switched over to honey and pollen, we see a huge decrease in juvenile hormone inside those bees. So if you think way back to entomology, juvenile hormone is the hormone that's responsible for determining if insects go on to their next life stage or not. So it determines if an insect will go into pupation or if it'll have another larval instar. So it seems that somehow juvenile hormone also determines if you are going to be able to produce eggs or not. And there is one hormone that appears, or one chemical that appears to be responsible for this transition that's called royalactin. It's in royal honey, and when they've basically extracted royalactin and fed it to worker bees during their development, they've been able to create what they call intercaste bees, or bees that are partially workers, partially queens. So it seems that royalactin is important in that transition, but they're not sure exactly how so. The other major thing that's important is going to be the choice of cells. So I already talked about worker versus drone cells. Queens have extremely different cells from those two. So if this is sort of a comb of regular bee cells, queens are actually produced in special cells called queen cups, or queen cells. And basically, these are cells that are oriented vertically, so they kind of stick out of the side of the comb and face downwards. They're about the size and shape of a peanut, and the whole face is downward. So if a queen encounters this, it doesn't look anything like a regular cell, so they know that this one's going to be a queen, the workers know this is a queen, and they know to provision it with royal jelly. Consequently, beekeepers, right, when you're pulling out your combs, if you pull out your combs and you see a whole bunch of these on there, that's usually a sign that your queen is in trouble. And so yeah, you chop those off because you don't want them to swarm and to fly away. You can sort of stop the swarm by getting rid of them. And that might be a hive that you're going to have to provision with a new queen later, or maybe do an artificial swarming event.
Since the worker bees are the ones that create the combs, so like Do the worker bees actually encourage what is actually fertilizing growth? So like, so if the workers were to create more queen cups, there'll be more queen bees.
That's the idea.
So if they were to create bigger holes or bigger cells, then there'll be more drones.
Yeah, so the workers are very in tune with what's going on inside the hive. So the workers are kind of aware of how much resources there are, because they're the ones doing all the work, right? So they're aware of how many forages there are, how many honey and pollen cells that they've been making. They're kind of just fundamentally aware of everything. I don't think any given bee is sitting there thinking, oh, we have a lot of resources, maybe we should split up and create a queen. But they are reacting to environmental cues, and they will, start building these things. Queen cups oftentimes will get built in response to crowding, to high resource availability. Sometimes they'll get built if the old queen just seems weak, and she's producing less pheromones, so the workers are a little more unruly, less under her control, so they'll start building things like this. But yeah, so it's the workers that really determine what's going on in the hive. Queen has some amount of ability to control them.
Say if you were to do it like an artificial swarming event, would it be just enough to take those frames out and put a new queen in a different box, or would you have to move those boxes away from each other considerably?
So typically what you would want to do is, just take the queen and some of the stuff and just move it into a new box. I just learned about this. I was at a meeting with some people who are planning that beekeeper course they're having in March, and they're telling me there's a rule in beekeeping called 2 inches or 2 miles, and the idea is that you never move your bee boxes more than about 2 inches, and if you are going to move them, you got to move them substantially, at least 2 miles away from where they were originally. And this is because bees orient using landmarks, so they know where their hive is relative to other things in the landscape. So bees will use other hives as landmarks, trees, rocks, all sorts of different features.
Don't they also have this incredible flying pattern? I suppose there's a food source out in the west, and depending on their flying pattern, that's the way they can come back to the hive and inform their fellow buddies to go out and seek the food because of the way it's kind of like mathematicians in a way. That's
Yes.
what the experiment I was doing with Dr. Gonzalez.
They do, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we jump into the next lecture, actually. But yeah, they have a waggle dance.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the waggle dance. So bees, so if you're a worker, and I'm a little short on slides today, I can talk. Okay, so if a bee goes out and finds a resource, right? So let's say I'm a forager. I'm flying around, I'm doing loops, I'm trying to find stuff. Actually, I didn't talk about this. I should have talked about it. So I mentioned earlier, right, when you're a forager, you've got 18 to 21 days where you're attracted to light, but during those 3 days, most of the bees aren't foragers. They're like guards and water carriers and stuff. Oftentimes during those days, what the bees are doing is they're going on little exploratory flights. So they'll fly out of the hive, they'll do a couple loops around the hive, maybe they'll fly out to some landmarks and they'll come back. And what those bees are doing is they're mapping the landscape. They're figuring out where is my hive relative to all these different landmarks. And they're building up a map in their mind. But let's say you are an actual forager, and this is your hive, and you fly out, and you find there's a whole bunch of flowers over here. Now you want to come back to the hive, and you want to tell all your buddies, hey, I found a whole stinking, garden full of flowers, ripe with nectar. Go out there and check it out. Well, the bees tell all their buddies through a dance. Basically, they'll crawl onto the comb where all the foragers are hanging out, and they have a special pattern where they will. Does anyone have an expo? Nope. I'll be right back. I'm gonna grab a marker. This is something that's much better. Why on earth am I getting a marker? I've got this fancy. Can I draw on this still? No. Oh, yeah. Beautiful. So basically what the bees will do is they'll stand on the comb, and I'll talk about this in more detail later when we talk about bee communication. But roughly what they do is they'll get the attention of all the other bees, and they'll walk in this sort of looping pattern. Let's get... So they'll walk in this looping pattern, where as they walk in a line, they sort of wiggle
their abdomens back and forth, wiggle, 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 wiggle. Then they'll loop back, and they'll wiggle, 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 wiggle again, loop back the other way, and they'll do this over and over again. And the basic idea is that the number of wiggles tells the bees approximately how far the food source is from the hive, and then the orientation of the wiggles relative to vertical tells them the direction from the hive that they're in. So they might wiggle, say, so if they're wiggling straight up and down, that might mean, and I believe it's all relative to the sun. It's been a while since I read about this. So if they're wiggling straight up and down, that would mean like straight into the sun. But if they're wiggling, say, at like a 25-degree angle, that would mean, you know, go out of the hive, turn 25 degrees to the sun, then fly this far, and you'll find this food source. And that's called the waggle dance. So bees can basically tell directionality based on the sun. They know distances. And so the trick is, what if you take your hive, right, and there's these bees doing their waggle dance, and you have a bunch of foragers out. You pick up your hive, you move it 50 feet to the left or to the right. You got all these bees foraging. They fly due back to where they expect their hive to be, and there's no hive there. It really screws your bees' minds. They don't understand that. And as it turns out, if you pick up beehives and you move them even like 1 or 2 feet in any given direction, and you can do this overnight when all the bees are inside the hive and they're not doing anything. When they go out to forage the next day, they're going to consistently keep landing in the spot where the beehive had been, because they don't have the ability to process that their hive is now sitting 2 feet off to the side. And so you'll get these big collections of bees just hanging out on the ground like, we're alive! And so they say, you want to move your beehives 2 inches, because then, you know, they'll still be able to find the hive. But you want to move it just this minute amount. If you're going to move the hives, then what you can do is you can move them, what they say, 2 miles. So you need to move them so far that they're outside of their original forage range. That way they're not going to encounter any of the landmarks they're used to and use those to incorrectly navigate back to where the hive used to be. And when they're in a new landscape, they'll go out and fly and they'll be like, whoa, this is not where we were, and they'll start that whole searching process of finding landmarks all over again.
Do you know what kind of landmarks they use? Like, what if they're using like a tractor and then you move the tractor? Will they like mess it up?
I think that could screw them up. If you've got like a tractor you've had parked in the same place for a really long time, then I would imagine that can screw them up a little bit. So yeah, I think you don't want to stick your bees down in a parking lot or anything like that. That might mess with their heads. But so what some of the beekeepers were talking about was this idea that like, so if you're like a backyard beekeeper, initial hive placement is really important. Because let's say you put the hive down and you decide, oh, well, I want them on the other side of my yard. Well, if you're a backyard keeper, you can't pick up your hive and move them 2 miles out. Because what some beekeepers will do is they'll pick up their hive, they'll put them 2 miles out somewhere else, and then they'll bring them back a couple weeks later and put them in the new place again. Just basically manually reset them twice. But if you're a backyard beekeeper, what you do is you pick up your hive, you scoot it about 2-3 inches. And then a couple weeks later, you scoot it 2-3 inches again. And you just keep slowly scooting them. So if you want to move 12 feet from under the trees of the wood pile, it's going to take you like months of scooting this darn hive.
So, I'm kind of wondering what's the percentage of bees that get left behind when the beekeeper goes and picks up the hives? Like, do they pick them up in the day and nighttime?
They'll pick them up at nighttime usually.
Okay.
So that
all
you,
the bees kind of go back up there.
yeah, so you don't lose them. Or at least you don't lose many of them. But yeah, so we'll talk about the waggle dance a little bit later today. But again, we'll talk about waggle dance in more detail. Let's see, can I shift? I guess I can source search. Well, anyway. Great. So that's an aside. All right, populations are seasonal. So generally what you'll find, right, we talked about this a little bit before, that beehive populations fluctuate over the course of seasons, such that you'll see different numbers of casts depending on what time of year it is. During nectar flows, so spring and early summer, you'll see a lot of drones, you'll see a lot of queens, because lots of hives are big, they're ready to swarm and create new hives. whereas worker numbers will sort of follow that pattern as well. Workers will peak in April through June. If you have a really good nectar flow, you may get as many as 60,000 workers in a single hive. Then after June, you'll see the slow decline of total worker numbers until you hit the middle of winter, where you'll have populations pretty low, usually in the 20,000 range, but sometimes as low as 10,000. Similarly, brood populations tend to fluctuate with the seasons, and the total amount of brood that a queen produces is going to be reflective of resources as well. So, like we talked about before, if it's January, the middle of the winter, and you don't have any resources, many queens just don't lay eggs at all. There's no reason to think that you're going to have any resources anytime soon, so the queens just sort of take a break. But then, when the nectar flow starts, queens may be laying up to 1,500 eggs every single day, just to catch up and keep brood numbers high. And there have been cases where people have counted up to 40,000 brood cells in a single hive. So, and considering that those brood cells will all be adult bees within 21 days, that can show very, very quick, very, very rapid population growth. All right, so queen replacement. We talked a little bit about queen replacement already in terms of swarming, but there are some cases where a queen is just weak. You'll have a hive where the queen is getting old, so she's not producing the pheromones very well anymore. She's losing control of her bees. Sometimes queens that aren't pollinated, queens that don't mate very well, so they have very little sperm in their spermatheca, they'll get to a point where they're accidentally laying a lot of drone eggs because they just don't have enough sperm to keep up with the number of workers. At that point, sometimes the workers will take things into their own hands, and they'll have basically a little bee coup, which they call a super seizure. And during a super seizure, basically, a bunch of workers will produce the queen cells. They'll produce an excess of queens. When the first queen hatches and mates and returns to the hive, the workers will treat the new queen as the actual queen, and basically they'll just stop giving the old queen resources. They sort of let her live out her old age until she starves to death because they're not feeding her anymore. But yeah, functionally they just abandon her. So that's a super seizure. Most beekeepers don't really allow super seizures to occur. They'll just do an artificial super seizure where you put a new queen in a bee box, in a little queen box, and you'll get rid of the queen cells and you'll smash the old queen. And just sort of let it happen that way. Anatomy. So something that bears stating is that bees are insects, right? So you've all had entomology, you know the parts of the insect, so I'm not going to belabor all the major points. But just to review, because they're insects, right, they're going to have the three major body segments: the head, that has all the sensory organs; you're going to have the thorax, which has all the locomotive appendages. So they've got two pairs of wings on their meta and mesothoracic segments. They've got 3 sets of legs, and then they have an abdomen with the majority of the internal organs. To each of these 3 sections, they do have significant modifications that help them live out their bee life cycle. So what I'm going to be focusing on in this lecture is the modifications to the body rather than the actual stuff. So we're not going to review like the parts of the chitinous exoskeleton or the parts of the legs or anything like that. Instead, we'll be talking about what makes bees different from other insects and makes them particularly good pollinators. So with that, today we're just covering the head. So as far as honeybee eyes are concerned, honeybees have 3 ocelli as well as 2 compound eyes on their heads. The ocelli are located on the top of the head, and they form roughly a little triangle right between their 2 compound eyes. So we've got an ocelli here, approximately here, here, and here. In case you can't really see it, the contrast isn't great on the picture. The function is not super well understood for the ocelli. What we do know about them is that they can detect light, but they're incapable of focusing an image. There's been some research in dragonflies that suggests that dragonflies can see rudimentary shapes with their ocelli. So like dragonflies can tell the difference between, say, a triangle versus a circle in their ocelli, but they can't see really good details. I saw a research project with orchard bees, which are adapted to forest landscapes, and they actually mapped out the ocelli using microwave mapping. And using that mapping technique, they found out that each of the ocelli have two different focus points. They have one that's straight up at the air and one that's sort of focused to the side. And they reason that these ocelli are actually able to detect polarized light, and they can use that in navigation relative to the sun. So that's a potential use. And we'll talk about polarized light in a little bit. Compound eyes are composed of just under 7,000 facets, and they are the actual image resolving eyes in the bee. So as you may remember in entomology, basically each of those individual facets in a compound eye is a little tiny eye. So it's like having an eye made out of 7,000 cameras. And each of those cameras is taking a very tiny picture of the world. And then your brain takes all those very tiny pictures and collates them together, squishes them into a single image, and that makes a really rough sort of mosaic with tiny pictures that you use to see the world. That's how bees see. So any given single image that a bee sees is not particularly well resolved, but by moving their heads, by flying around, and sort of moving that image around, bees can get a reasonably good idea of what the environment around them looks like. So this leads me to some really interesting research on how bees see and whether bees can detect things like color or not. That was done by this guy. This is Karl von Frisch. He was an Austrian ethologist who was doing a lot of his research around about the 1940s, so he kind of got caught up in that whole World War II thing that they had over in Europe. But not really involved, but like a lot of his research was kind of lost to the world because there was a big war. But he was an ethologist, which means that he's someone who studies animal behavior. And he used bees as his major study system. And he discovered a lot of the primary stuff we know about bees. He's the person who figured out what the purpose of the waggle dance was. Before this, there was no evidence of communication between anything lower than like a dog. And so the idea that bees have a language that they use to communicate with each other was a huge breakthrough. He figured out that bees have color vision. He figured out the resolution of bee eyes. And through all this work, he ended up getting a Nobel Prize. But I like his work just because he's got these really elegant little studies. So Karl von Frisch was interested in whether bees have the ability to see color. And so he devised a really simple experiment to figure it out. Where what he did was he set out what was called the color card experiment. So basically, bees find resources by foraging around, right? They find a resource, they eat it. If it's good, they go back to the hive, they tell all their buddies where it is. And then they return to the site and they'll make multiple trips until the food source is depleted. So what Karl von Frisch did was he set out a little container of sugar water on top of a piece of blue paper. And basically, the bees would come out to that piece of blue paper and feed, fly back to the hive, tell all their buddies where the blue paper was, and they would go back and forth between the two. And Karl von Frisch reasoned that if honeybees are able to see color, they'll be able to recognize that there is a blue card that has the food source on it, and they will visit the blue card preferential to, say, other colors. So after a few days of training bees that blue cards have sugar water on them, he introduced a new card, a red card. He put the red card and the blue card next to each other. Each of them had a cup on them, but the red card had, actually I think when he did this experiment, both cards had regular water in them, no sugar water at all, so that the bees wouldn't visit one or the other and start showing preference. And what he found was when initial bee visitors came,
they almost all went to the blue card before ever visiting the red card. That it seemed that the bees recognized that blue was associated with food, and so he reasoned that bees could see blue as a color. And he would flip the position, so maybe like there would be like 4 red cards, around the blue card, or there'd be multiple blue cards and 1 red card. And basically he did a whole bunch of variations just to rule out the idea that maybe the bees were always feeding on the one on the left or the one on the right. So he did this. But then he had a thought, what if bees are colorblind, but what it turns out is that the 2 cards he used show up as different shades of gray. So then maybe this red is a really bright shade of gray, and this blue is a really dark shade of gray in bee vision. And so he wanted to rule out the possibility that he was just playing with different levels of brightness. So he designed a new experiment where he took his blue card, he trains the bees again to go after blue, and he sets it out in a bunch of other cards that are all different shades of gray. And he reasoned that if bees can see the color blue, then the bees again will go for the blue card, and they won't bother visiting all the gray cards, because they'll be able to tell the difference between blue and gray. But if bees are incapable of seeing blue, this is what it'll look like to them. The blue card will appear as gray, and he reasoned that at least 1 or 2 of the other blocks are going to look similar enough to blue that he'll have bees visiting the blue card and the grays that are similar in color. So he runs this experiment, and again, the bees are going for blue, 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 over and over again. So he's reasonably confident that bees can see the color blue and can home in on it. And so he repeats this experiment multiple times using different colors. And using this approach, he figures out that bees can see blue. Bees can also see the color orange. They can see yellow. They can see green. They can see purple. And they can see violet. And specifically, they don't just see violet, but bees can actually see into the ultraviolet range. So bees can see colors that we as humans are incapable of seeing, given the limitations of our particular eyes. So, what am I missing? Red. Bees don't see red. When he ran this experiment over and over again, what he found was that bees would randomly visit any number of gray squares when given a red option. To bees, red looks very similar to black. The colors are virtually identical. So ultimately, using his work, this is the vision range that they found for bees. So at the top here we have human range. Our vision is skewed towards the reds, so we can see into the very edge of the violets. And I was researching this, violet and purple are different colors because purple is sort of a mix of reds and blues, whereas violet is the very edge of ultraviolet light. It appears purplish to us due to our cone and rod structure, but it is its own color and its own wavelength. Bees, on the other hand, they don't have much of any red. They can see just the very edge of red. They can see enough red that they can tell the difference between, say, yellow and orange. They can tell when some red wavelength is mixed with yellow. But they can't see true red. But they have, as you can see over here, pretty extensive vision in the ultraviolet range that we do not see. Consequently, bees see the world very differently from us. And in fact, many flowers are adapted to appeal to bees in a way that doesn't appeal to us. So many flowers that look very plain will actually have extensive ultraviolet marking that is used to attract bees to them. So here, for example, is a field full of bluebells. This is with human vision, and then this is the same picture taken with a special camera developed to basically mimic bee vision. And as you can see, all the purple flowers here really pop, sort of a bright green against the landscape. So just sort of their way. And then similarly, we have all these white flowers at the bottom of the screen here. You see in this picture, they're a bright yellow. So just sort of built these flowers have evolved to be extra appealing to bees. Similarly, when we look at flowers that have what appear to be nice, bright coloration as it is, oftentimes when we look with bee vision, we'll see that they've evolved little landing pads. Or similarly, sometimes we'll see flowers with stripes in them that are, let me change the color of that. You'll see sort of stripes that are thick at the top and narrow in the middle, almost like they're landing pads pointing the bees towards the middle, where the pollen is supposed to be. There's actually been some really interesting research where people will pull the petals off flowers, turn them around and glue them back on so the arrows point out the wrong way, and bees will land on the flower and run off the edge. So, there's all sorts of coloration that we are just not privy to because we don't see the world the way bees do. Which raises an interesting question. Why are there so many red flowers? If bees can't see the color red, why do we have all these red flowers in the world? Because red flowers are a really common thing. And in general, what we found is that, for the most part, if you see red flowers, they are primarily pollinated by birds or bats, organisms that do see the color red. And bees do not really frequent them. That being said, there are red flowers that are visited by bees, so bees will visit red flowers, so will flies, beetles, things like that. Most insects don't see reds very well, but they will have trouble finding those flowers. So the rate of visitation is much lower in red flowers than it would be in yellows, purples, blues, things like that. And there have been studies that have shown that if bees are introduced to a food source with red flowers, they tend to have trouble telling the flowers and the foliage apart. You can see that in this picture. We have some nice rhododendrons with some nice red flowers here, here, here. And when we look at that in bee vision, you can see some of those flowers just completely disappear. I mean, they're completely hidden in the foliage.
So what colors of flowers in mind attract bees the most that look like a specific?
Bees really like, I don't know about specifics, but bees tend to really like flowers that have nice ultraviolet patterns on them. That seems to be pretty typical. Bees do visit a lot of yellow flowers, a lot of white flowers, a lot of yellows, whites, purples, oranges, a little less so. But those seem to be sort of the ones they're really big into. And blues. They'll visit blues, but there's not a lot of blue flowers. It seems to be a difficult color. But yeah, they'll take longer to visit flowers. Yeah. Great. So actually, speaking of rhododendrons, this was something that I didn't cover in the history of beekeeping, but if bees feed extensively on rhododendron flowers, their honey will be a little bit narcotic, because there are compounds in the rhododendron nectar that is slightly toxic to humans. So there are regions around, say, like the Baltic Sea, where there's extensive rhododendron growth. And when they all bloom, people will not harvest honey during that period because the honey is toxic. And there's been stories of like Alexander the Great was marching his army through that region, and they stopped and they found there were a bunch of beehives, so they harvested the honey. And stories about this whole army being sick for like 3 days because they've essentially been poisoned by these rhododendron flowers. Similarly, there's like a story of the, I believe, the Romans were marching through, right, and they get fed rhododendron honey by the locals. The locals sort of trick them. They bring them all this honeycomb. They get sick as dogs, and the locals sweep into the camp and kill a whole ton of Romans. And then the Romans come back and kill all the locals because they're upset. But you don't mess with the Romans. But yeah, so rhododendron honey is kind of its whole own thing. And around about there, I don't know if they do it anymore, but it used to be the case that you would make mead with the honey from the rhododendrons, and it would have sort of psychotropic properties. So, extra value mead. So Carl von Frisch was also interested in whether bees, how much resolution bee eyes had. And so he repeated his card experiment, but instead of using colors, he put patterns on the cards, so little hand-drawn images. He wanted to know what kind of patterns could bees see. Because if you think about how bees see the world, each lens, right, is that single tile in a mosaic or a single pixel in an image. And so bees can roughly resolve an image, and so if we're looking at, say, this flower, they can see the petals and the rough pattern on it, but it's just a very crude approximation. So, and actually, if you look at this image, right, you can see the petals, the but you can't really see the stamen or the stigma or anything. You can't see much of anything in the background. None of that resolves very well. So what Karl von Frisch found out is that bees, unsurprisingly, are really good at telling apart flower shapes. So bees were able to identify the shapes of flowers. They were able to tell the difference between these two patterns and regularly home to one but not the other. They could also recognize solid shapes, but they could not tell the difference. To a bee, a circle, a square, a triangle, and this diagonal line are all identical. They can't tell the difference between any of those. Similarly, bees can't tell the difference between any of these shapes. So basically, line drawings all look very similar to bees. So this is an interesting case. Bees can't tell the difference between these or these, but bees can tell the difference between any of these single comparisons. So bees will not confuse things in this line with this line, but within the lines they're completely helpless to tell the difference. So bee vision's kind of tricky. He actually did some really interesting experiments where he had removable plates that he would slide over the fronts of bee hives, and bees will learn to recognize their own hive by the pattern on the front. And so he experimented with a whole bunch of different patterns on the front, and then he would swap them to see if the bees would get confused and fly to the wrong hive. And that's another way he sort of figured out colors and patterns. All right. And then the last thing I want to cover on bee vision is polarized light. So bees are pretty unique in the, well, not that unique, actually, most other animals. Bees are very different from us in that they can see polarization in light. So just as a reminder, the idea of polarized light is that when you have light emitting from a light source, like the sun or from a light bulb or whatever, the light is coming out as a waveform, and the waveform is oriented in all sorts of different directions. So maybe the wave of light is going straight up vertical. Maybe it's going side to side. Maybe it's rotating at like a 45-degree angle. But the idea is you have this waveform going up and down. If that light were to pass through a filter, you know, we could create a filter of very fine vertical lines. And if the light hits that filter, the only light that'll pass through are the wavelengths that are perfectly aligned for the little slat we put in the filter. So that we basically filter out all the side-to-sides, all the diagonal lines, so only straight-up vertically oscillating light passes through that filter. If all the wavelengths of the light are going the exact same direction, we call that polarized light. And that's how polarized sunglasses work, right? Polarized sunglasses are basically just glass where they've superimposed a bunch of impermeable black lines all in a row facing the same direction so that you're filtering the light out. Does that make sense? Great. Yeah. So, what's interesting about bees, so if I were to look at a human eyeball, and I were to look at the distribution of rods and cones in our eyes, so like let's say this is a human eye. We've got a focus point in the middle of our eye called the fovea, where we basically focus all of our light in, and that's where more or less all of our light focusing ability is. If we were to look in there, all of your rods, your rods and cones are oriented in all sorts of different directions. It's like a big mess in there. And so consequently, light can hit this at any given angle, and it's going to hit something that's going to detect it. So we just sort of take all light and say, light is light. It doesn't matter what direction it's oscillating in. But if you were to look at a bee's eye and look in at its fovea, all of its rods are lined up in nice little rows. Consequently, light that's oriented in different ways, so if light hits it, say, sideways, it's going to hit all these rods right here. If it's vertical, it might just hit a single set of rods. And so bees are very good at detecting what direction the wavelengths are coming in. So they can detect polarization. So this may make you wonder, who gives a shit? Why does it matter that bees can see polarized light? What does that mean to me as someone who's interested in bees or someone who wants to learn about bees? Well, polarization matters because, as it turns out, light coming from the sun is polarized. The sun, when it emits light, the light is like any other light source. There's all sorts of different light waves flying all over the place. But as light passes through the atmosphere, it starts hitting things. It hits molecules of ozone. It hits molecules of nitrogen, like N2, that's triple bound. And when it hits those molecules, light refracts. And it shoots off in all sorts of different directions. And as it works out, so let's say this is a particle that light is bouncing off of. You can see the particles, the black part, all the yellow lines are the areas the light is shooting out in. It's being refracted in all sorts of different directions. What's kind of cool about this is if you are standing directly at 90 degrees, so let's say, do I have room to draw over here? Not there. I'll turn on the whiteboard again. Let's say this is the direction the light is traveling in. It's heading this way. And here's a little speck of dust. The light hits that. It gets refracted in all sorts of different directions. What's kind of cool about this is if I'm right here, and I'm observing this, if I am directly at 90 degrees from the direction that the light hit, the light waves are going to be perfectly polarized so that they are only traveling up and down. So as long as you're 90 degrees to where the light is striking, you'll have perfectly polarized light to look at. All right. Consequently, depending on where the sun is relative to you, if the sun is directly over your head, then you are standing basically at 90 degrees to the sun at the horizon. So if you were to look out at the horizon, all the light around the horizon is going to be polarized, coming right at you. And if you have, say, a polarized lens on your sunglasses or a little polarized piece of filter paper, you can test this by going out with your sunglasses, and at like around the middle of the day, you can hold your sunglasses out to the horizon, hold them horizontally, and then rotate them sideways. And you notice that the sky gets a lot darker when you turn them sideways, because you're filtering out a whole bunch of those vertically oscillating bands. So now, the reason that this is important to bees is that basically, as the sun moves through the sky, that band of dark polarization is going to follow the sun at a 90-degree angle to it. Consequently, if the sun is, say, at the horizon, or straight above you, right, it's going to be at the horizon. But if the sun is down near the horizon, 90 degrees from the sun is going to be straight above you. So you're going to see this ring going over the top of you, top to bottom. So bees, basically, when they're flying around, they can see this polarized ring going through the sky as the day progresses. So bees are able to basically see that polarized ring, and they can tell, one, approximately where the sun is in the sky. Even if it's super cloudy and you can't see the sun at all, they can see that polarization ring. And two, they have a rough approximation of what time of day it is, no matter if the sun is visible or not, because they can see where that ring is progressing and can tell if it's, basically if the ring's in the middle, they can say, oh, it's approximately, the middle of the day. If it's up in the sky way high, they can say, oh, it's almost dark. They have the ability to use all of that. So basically, there's been a lot of interesting studies where Carl von Frisch did these too, where basically what he would do is he would capture bees. So he'd set up a little false flower, right? They'd come out, they'd be feeding in this false flower, he'd catch all those bees, and then he'd drive like 2 miles off in the opposite direction, and he'd release the bees. And he reasoned if bees are only using their landmarks to navigate, then they're not going to be able to find their way back to the hive. They're going to get super lost. But as it works out, when you release those bees, they can fly out. They'll recognize the landmarks are different. And then they'll use the sun to figure out where they are relative to the hive, and they'll actually fly straight back to the hive, just using sun navigation and some of the landmarks they can see in the area. So that's why polarization matters. It's just a great way that bees can navigate and find their way back. Of course, they're flying back to the location they believe the hive is in, so if you move the hive 6 feet over, they'll go and land on that spot where the hive used to be. But so anyway, just to sort of visualize how this works, I've just got like a little 1-minute video. So here's just showing what the sequence is. So the idea here is that these would represent like each of a bee's ommatidia in their eye. And so the idea is that when bees are flying, what they'll have is basically a whole row of ommatidia that are going to be slightly darker than all the ones around them. And that row of ommatidia is basically going to approximate the direction of that band of polarization in the sky. And they can use that angle to determine what time of day it is and what direction they're flying in. Oh man, Microsoft. But yeah, so one last thing before you go, just to tie that into the polarization. Earlier when we talked about that waggle dance, right? I talked about how when they waggle, right, there's a directionality to it. What that directionality is the polarization of the sun. So basically, their arrows basically show the bees when you leave the hive, orient yourself at this angle to the polarization of the sun, and fly in this direction for so long, and that's how you'll find the food source. So that's why we talk about polarization. But anyway,